The following was written by Robert Wright and published in Dodge City, the Cowboy Capital in 1913. Now, to protect ourselves and property, we were compelled to organize a vigilance committee. Our very best citizens promptly enrolled themselves, and, for a while, it fulfilled its mission to the letter and acted like a charm, and we were congratulating ourselves on our success. The committee only had to resort to extreme measures a few times, and gave the hardy characters warning to leave town, which they promptly did. But what I was afraid would happen did happen. I had pleaded and argued against the organization for this reason, namely, hard, bad men kept creeping in and joining until they outnumbered the men who had joined it for the public good, until they greatly outnumbered the good members. And when they felt themselves in power, they proceeded to use that power to avenge their grievances and for their own selfish purposes, until it was a farce, as well as an outrage on common decency. They got so notoriously bad and committed so many crimes that the good members deserted them, and the people arose in their might and put a stop to their doings. They had gone too far and saw their mistake after it was too late. The last straw was the cold-blooded, brutal murder of a polite, inoffensive, industrious Negro named Taylor, who drove a hack between the fort and Dodge City. Whilst Taylor was in a store making purchases, a lot of drunken fellows got into his wagon and was driving it off. When Taylor ran out and tried to stop them, they say a man by the name of Scotty shot him, and after Taylor fell, several of them kept pumping lead into him. This created a big row, as the Negro had been a servant for Colonel Richard I. Dodge, commander of the fort, who took up his cause and sent some of them to the penitentiary. Scotty got away and was never heard of afterwards. Robert Wright. Dodge City's reputation for violent murders and gunfights was established during the first 2 years of the town's existence, from 1872 to 1874. Men being killed in the streets was not good for business, and the businessmen needed to solve the problem if Dodge City was to become a commercial center of the frontier. In order for there to be a legal sheriff, Ford County would first need to be organized, and for Dodge City to have a legal city marshal with policemen, then Dodge would first need to be incorporated. Ford County was not organized until April 5th, 1873, and Dodge City was not incorporated until November 2nd, 1875. From its beginning in June of 1872 until elections were held on June 5th, 1873, Dodge City was in a kind of legal limbo. The citizens were trying to get the county organized so they could have a sheriff, but until then, they would have to make do. The businessmen decided that a hired gun was perhaps the only way, and so they hired William L. Brooks to fill that role. William Brooks, better known as Billy Brooks, or Bully Brooks, had been the Marshal of Newton, Kansas, but by October of 1872, Brooks was in Dodge City. Brooks was good at shooting people, but proved to be a lousy lawman. On December 23rd, Brooks had a shootout with ex-railroad yardmaster Mr. Brown, in which Brown was shot in the head. The newspapers reported that Mr. Brown had been killed, but according to Robert Wright, Brown actually recovered, the ball having exited and the wound healed. On December 28th, saloon keeper Matt Sullivan was shot and killed. Some said it was Brooks who was behind the shooting. On January 17th, 1873, 3 men were killed at a dance hall. 5 or 6 men had become drunk and started to fight, which resulted in the shooting deaths of Barney Cullen, Edward Hurley, and another man by the name of Southers. No mention was made of hired gun Bully Brooks, who was paid to try and stop this behavior. Sometime in January or early February, a gang of Texas buffalo hunters and gamblers had come to Dodge City and tried to gain control of the town. This was too much for Dodge City businessmen. A gang of toughs was not going to boss them around, and their hired gun, Billy Brooks, was nowhere to be found. On the evening of February 8th, 1873, the businessmen of Dodge City organized a vigilance committee to run the gang out of town. On the night of February the 9th, the members of the Vigilance Committee walked to the dance hall where the gang was and shot and killed the two leaders, Charles Hill and Ed Williams. They pointed their guns at the 5 remaining gang members and ordered them out of town. The gang members, deeming discretion the better part of valor, decamped for more advantageous hunting grounds. At the time the Vigilance Committee was organized, there were 20 members. We don't know all the names of the Dodge City Vigilance Committee, but we do know several. In his book, Robert Wright includes himself as one of the members, although he later became critical of the organization. We know that James Hanrahan, a buffalo hunter and saloon keeper, was a member. Tom Sherman, saloon and dance hall owner, was a member. John Scotty Scott and Bill Hicks were also members. This Vigilance Committee was a very loose-knit group of people who lived in Dodge City, businessmen and employees who did not want others running their town. There were no officers, no rigid organization, and no oversight. Even with the Vigilance Committee making the news in Dodge City, Billy Brooks was not quite done with the town. On March 4th, 1873, Brooks was in Dodge City when buffalo hunter Kirk Jordan began shooting at him. Brooks had killed a friend of Jordan's, and so the buffalo hunter was intent on revenge. Thankfully for Brooks, somebody accidentally stepped between the two, which gave Brooks time to see that someone was gunning for him and hid behind a barrel of water. Jordan fired. The bullet was stopped by the iron hoop of the water barrel. Brooks had difficulty in drawing the gun from his holster and chose to run away, hiding in a nearby livery stable. Robert Wright helped smuggle Brooks out of town, and that was the last Dodge City saw of Bully Brooks. Even though Dodge City was down one notorious gunslinger, more bodies would pile up. On March 11th, James Hanrahan led a group of vigilantes to chase a buffalo hunter named McGill out of Dodge City. McGill had been firing his pistol in a dance hall and causing trouble. As he was chased out of Dodge, McGill opened fire on the vigilantes. Hanrahan and the others responded by filling McGill with lead. McGill's body was dragged to Boot Hill Cemetery. On March 12th, Tom Sherman would shoot and kill a man named Burns. This was not done in self-defense. Tom Sherman had killed a friend of Burns and decided he just didn't trust having Burns around alive. Being a member of the Vigilance Committee meant Tom Sherman didn't have to worry about consequences. By this time, Dodge City had a very short and bloody history, but the next death would change everything. On June 4th, 1873, William Taylor was brutally murdered on the streets of Dodge City. William Taylor was an African-American from Leavenworth, Kansas, who had traveled to Fort Dodge to visit his brother, who worked for the commander. While at Fort Dodge, Taylor became interested in the transportation of freight between the military forts. He decided to stay at Fort Dodge and became a private cook for the commander at the fort, Colonel Richard Irving Dodge. Once Dodge City began, Taylor gained permission from Colonel Dodge to run a transportation service between the town and Fort Dodge. Taylor hired a man to drive a light spring wagon pulled by a pair of mules to carry soldiers, officers, and civilians to and from the fort. Besides running this wagon service, Taylor wanted to set up a restaurant in Dodge City. If his cooking was good enough for the post commander, it would have been more than enough for the hungry buffalo hunters who crowded into town. William Taylor was what early Dodge City needed, a talented entrepreneur who was was willing to work and provide much-needed services. But corruption in the Vigilance Committee had grown to the point that innocent lives were in danger, as had happened with Tom Sherman killing Burns. Sometime during the early morning hours on June 4th, a disagreement arose between the wagon driver and a group of men wishing to go to the fort. One of the men pointed a pistol at the driver and tried to shoot him, but the gun misfired. The man then severely struck the driver on the nose with the pistol. The wagon driver went to William Taylor and told him what had happened. Taylor tried to defuse the situation and spoke to the group of men, but they responded by shooting and killing one of his mules. Upset, Taylor gave the group a piece of his mind. At this moment, another gunshot was heard. The watchman at the depot cried out that Taylor had shot him. This was not the case. It turned out that the watchman had shot himself by accident. The group then turned their guns on Taylor and shot him in the left breast and in the kidneys. Taylor staggered into a nearby drugstore to receive medical attention from Dr. McCarty. The depot watchman who had shot himself was a brother of Bill Hicks, one of the members of the Vigilance Committee. John Scott, another vigilante, had been part of the group in the wagon. Scott and Hicks, together with their friends, stormed the drugstore and shot and killed Taylor. Dr. McCarty and the owner of the drugstore ran for their lives. Scott, Hicks, and the others dragged Taylor's body out into the street, where they continued to shoot his lifeless corpse. Word reached quickly to Colonel Dodge at the fort about William Taylor's murder. The colonel sent a telegram to Kansas Governor Osborne for permission to make arrests and hold the prisoners. With permission granted, the next day, a company of soldiers surrounded Dodge City and arrested 5 men involved. Bill Hicks was one of the men arrested, but John Scott escaped. The governor offered a $500 reward for the capture of Scott, but no one would claim the money. Scott disappeared, and no one knew what happened to him. Of the 5 who were arrested, the court could only find evidence to convict Bill Hicks. There was still fear in Dodge of the Vigilance Committee, and witnesses were timid to come forth and testify. This cold-blooded murder not only shocked Dodge City, it became national news, articles about it being published in the Kansas City Times and the New York Tribune. Law and order needed to be brought to Dodge City. The citizens of Dodge had been trying to for some time. A census had been completed for Ford County by January 1873. 607 people were listed in the census. 600 were required for the county to be organized. A board for Ford County was organized at the end of April. The date for the special election of county officers was made for June the 5th. One day after the murder of William Taylor, the county election took place. Charles Bassett was made sheriff, George Cox was made judge, and P.T. Bowen and Thomas Nixon made justices of the peace. The reign of the Vigilance Committee was thankfully over. It had started as a way for the people of Dodge City to defend themselves against roaming bands of desperate men, but it had ended as the perpetrator of senseless violence.